If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
9, 8,
7,
6, 5, 4,
3, 2,
1. I think that is fair to
as I
say.
hands to kiss and babies to shake. But
I think my record speaks for itself.
That's a really good question.
Hello and welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jason Rosenbaum. Alongside me in studio in St. Louis is
Joe Mannies.
And our special guest who's wearing a fantastic purple sport coat with the name of his fraternity on it.
Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated.
And the gentleman.
Oh, Rodney Hubbard.
Yeah. Yes, we were having a fraternity on the podcast today. First of all, thank you so much for being on our show. We have a political legend in the house.
Yes.
Thank you. I mean, I'm in the studio with legends. Jason, I've been a fan of yours for a long time. And Joe, I've been a fan of yours for a long time, way before I even thought about even entering into politics. So
We don't have to emphasize how old.
No. I appreciate you.
It's okay. So just for our listeners, so they know, you're currently a consultant.
Yeah,
Democratic consultant.
Lobbyist, Democrat.
But can you talk a little bit about your background? Because you have a very legendary political background of your own.
Well, prior to running for state office, I was a state employee, worked for the Office of Administration, and spent a little stint working for the Division of Youth Services. So back in 2003, I ran for office, won by 35 votes, ran against a guy whose name was Rodney Bouchard, changed his name to Paris Bouchard, and ran against a legendary family by the name of the Fords, Louis Ford, who was a mentor of mine, ran against his son, Tony Ford Walker, and the famous Bill Haas. So I won by 35 votes, and the rest has been history.
Now, haven't you also been a committeeman in the city?
Yeah, I started serving as a committeeman in the 5th Ward around 2004, and then I left that spot, and then my mother ended up becoming a committee woman, and my father ended up becoming a committeeman in the 5th Ward.
Mm-hmm. So is your mother still the committee woman?
She's still a committee woman in the 5th Ward.
Okay, and she's also
the state
representative.
Of her, I think it's a 78.
Yeah, and for full disclosure, I actually used to live in that district, but it was slightly before your mother took office. Every day when I walked out of my apartment complex, I saw a big banner on the fence with her face on it, and I was like, Mother Hubbard is always watching. Sort of like Big Brother, it was Big Mother.
And
basically.
my wife is the committee woman in the 26th Ward.
And your sister is an alderwoman for St. Louis.
5th Ward.
So, you kind of come from this political dynasty family, so to speak. I think anytime you have more than 3 or 4 people in office, you can call it almost a dynasty.
I like to say if I would have won in 2008 for that Senate seat when I was running against Robin Wright Jones and I lost by 95 votes, maybe none of them would be in office.
Yeah, because I don't want to relive too much bad memories here because that seems to be like the only loss like your family has ever suffered electorally. Is that true?
That's true.
Yeah, and that was an interesting...
I mean, her good friends to this day.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing. You and Robin Wright Jones have buried the hatchet. Yeah. I think your son and her grandson go to the same high school now.
Yeah, they were attending CBC together, so I used to see my son and Damon, which is Robin's son.
Right.
Both our sons played for CBC and played on the football team.
But I wanted to use this as a jumping off point because back in the 2000s, when I was just starting out reporting on Jefferson City politics, and I noticed that there was a pretty stark divide between lawmakers like you who were a little bit more pragmatic, sometimes worked with Republicans, were more favorable to quote-unquote school choice, and then people like now former Senator Wright Jones who were opposed to that, or maybe even former Senator Maida Coleman who was also kind of in that camp, and you're apparently also good friends with her now.
Right.
What was it like back then? Why was there such this personal, stark divide within the St. Louis political black community there?
I think it was just, it was something new. You have to remember a lot of African Americans when you talk about the public school system, that's like a sacred cow.
Yeah.
And a lot of, even in my family and even with my in-laws, you have a lot of people in your family who worked in the St. Louis public school system, and that was the only way for them to really, receive gainful employment. So you had people who were legendary in the fields of science and arts and mathematics, but the only place they could get a job was through the public education realm. So they came from Maida Coleman and Robin Wright Jones. They were brought up a different way, and they felt that any approach to education reform was attack on public education. So I think it was just a lot of mixed information put out there. But I think due to President Obama getting elected and his Secretary of Education at that time, Orny Duncan, was pushing education reform and the Race to the Top program, and that kind of educated more folks in the state legislature.
Because one of the things that I've noticed is I still think there's a lot of infighting within the St. Louis black community, but I don't really know if it's issue-based anymore. My Rosetta Stone, perhaps, is that Chris Carter Sr., Joshua Peters race where there didn't seem to be any difference between them on issues, but it was all about personalities and personal beefs and,
That's
Congressman
true.
Clay. Have you noticed that as well?
I've noticed that it was kind of like this faction against that faction and, who was going to maintain the power. But, going back to your initial question with the education reform issue, you look at Senator Jamila Nasheed and Senator Maria Chappelle Nadal. If you look back in 2006, they were totally against anything that dealt with education reform.
Certainly Chappelle Nadal. And we've asked her that question, and she says that she's basically changed on that issue.
Yeah, now, one of the things I would like to make clear is I think this is not necessarily a racial issue as far as the splits within the St. Louis area delegation. I think a lot of it is generational because you see this among the white legislators and lawmakers as well. Rodney and I were talking before we went on the air how 20 years ago in South St. Louis, John Scott ruled. He was a state senator, and anybody, any white lawmaker, anybody even looking to run for office,
yeah, to anoint you.
You had to have the approval of Scott or Red Villa back in the day, who was a legendary alderman who I was lucky enough to know, Tom Villa's father. So my point being is that there used to be this hierarchy.
Oh, Marty Abusi.
Right. Yes, there used to be this hierarchy. Regardless of race, it was generational. There was the kingmakers, so to speak, and then gradually things changed as the new generations came up.
And on the north side, you would have to have the approval
of the congressman,
the congressman or Senator Jed Banks or individuals like that.
Yeah.
To say, hey,
yeah,
because
I remember covering St. Louis Board of Aldermen meetings where Jed Banks would literally stand there in the room, not just like off in a side room, in the room, watching to make sure. I mean, he would like be 2 feet from, let's say, the Roberts brothers when they were both aldermen to make sure that they voted the way he wanted on certain things. I mean, the elder congressman, Bill Clay Sr., he didn't do that. He didn't have to do that. Well, for one thing, his brother was an alderman for a lot of the time. But the point is that it was very much, it was no secret about who was in charge. Yeah. Now I think it's a lot more diffuse. I mean, north and south, black and white, as far as the power base, and I think a lot of it is this generational change.
I totally agree. Even back when I first ran for office back in 2003, I had to go and sit down and talk with, the Jed Banks, the Bosleys of the world, Freeman Bosleys of the world, to see where I could garner some support. And it was extremely hard as an outsider to come in and say, I want to run, because if you don't have the support, you're not going to get elected. What kind of helped me, what did help me was, my father and my grandfather all was tied into the church and the community, so it gave me a base. And I used to go back and forth with my father. He said, well, you have a base down here in the Court Square neighborhood. I said, you don't need a base, you just all work. But I didn't show you what I knew about politics.
Yeah. Well, I want to use this again as another jumping off point. You have a lot of jumping off points on this show. But I kind of want to talk about a little bit about next year. There's kind of rumblings that Congressman Clay, it could be challenged in a Democratic primary by potentially Senator Maria Chappelle Nadal. I want to play a clip of me asking her directly about a year and a half ago whether she would actually pull the trigger and run against Congressman Clay. Do you think he might have gotten involved because he sees you as a potential threat to run against him in 2 years?
Listen, I want to have a family. I have put public service first. And it is more important to me to be in a committed relationship, to be in a loving relationship, and just see how everything else falls. But that's very important to me. And there are a lot of people who are out there who say that I'm going to run against him, but nothing in the world means more to me than to having a family.
Now, a lot has changed. That I asked that question in March 2014. That was obviously before she got involved in the Carter-Josh Peters race. That was before Ferguson. And I would have to ask her again directly, but it seems like there's a lot of people kind of egging her on to challenge Congressman Lacy Clay. I don't know if you're on one side or the other of that battle, but what do you kind of think will happen next year?
Well, I think, first of all, I mean, numbers don't lie. It's extremely hard to go up against a sitting incumbent. Let's take the Cornahans, for instance. No one has spent more money on name ID in this state than the Cornahan family. And Russ Cornahan was a good friend of mine. He ran against Lacy Clay, who's another good friend of mine, and he ended up losing. So
big.
Yeah, big. So you have to weigh who has the name IDs, who has the strongest name ID, and who has the strongest ground game.
What's sort of the landscape, let's say in North St. Louis County, but also in the city, where I think Ferguson, the whole episode, has kind of broiled the political water separate from the social economic controversies about who is up, who is down. Some people have gotten more on TV, like Antonio French. Just different things. I'm interested in your take on this, just sort of looking at it as a observer, more or less, what you're seeing.
Well, I see it's a lot of factions out here. Like you alluded to earlier, it's not like back in the days when you had a power boss in North St. Louis or South St. Louis. So you talk about Maria. She was on the news a lot. During the whole Ferguson situation. So she's increased her followers on Twitter. So she's created her base. You look at people like Antonio French, who went to over 100,000 followers on Twitter. I always thought that Antonio French would run against Congressman Clay as opposed to Maria Chappelle Nadal, because when I travel the country, people always ask me if I know Antonio French.
And obviously you do, because
right.
I think that you actually supported his first aldermanic bid, and I'm not really sure what your relationship is with him right now.
Well, do you think he might challenge Clay?
I don't know. But you would think, if someone were going to challenge Clay, it would be Antonio French because of the following that he has nationally. Antonio has the following nationally, not Maria.
Well, I wanted to ask you this, and I would love to ask the congressman this, and then hopefully we'll get him on the show eventually. But during that Carter-Joshua Peters race, I heard a lot of Carter supporters basically saying that the Lacy Clay machine wasn't as strong as it used to be, that Lacy is kind of a shadow of his father politically, that he doesn't really work very hard. And then, the result of that was that Joshua Peters won by 10 points. Many attribute the fact that Joshua Peters was an excellent candidate, but also the fact that Lacy Clay did work hard and his machine did get revving. Do you think that, maybe people may be underestimating the congressman?
Such as anything, when you're involved in it, people always will want to test you and see if you still have the wherewithal to pull it off. But I think it was a combination of things. I think Josh was a great candidate. I think he was a better candidate. He was educated. Me and him share the same alma mater at Lincoln University in Jefferson City. I think Josh was just not only a better candidate, he was a younger-looking candidate. He came with fresher ideas, but you cannot, neglect the power of the congressman with his organization. But one of the smart things he did, even when he ran against Congressman Cornahan, it wasn't so much about his organization. It was about other folks who he detached, who had organizations, and he built a coalition around that. And I think that's that's what made them strong. But it was the test of who really had the juice in North St. Louis. Was it the Carters or was it the Clays? And I think Clay showed that in the end, he pulled it off for Josh because he was out there. I'd never seen a congressman, and I've been knowing him all my life. He's never went door to door for me.
Yeah.
But he was there every day going door to door. It was a must win for him.
Yeah.
Now, one of your clients is the city of St. Louis, correct?
Correct.
And so you're a consultant for the city in Jefferson City. Now, I want to emphasize major municipalities and counties like St. Louis County or Kansas City, they have different lobbyists or different consultants who are there in Jeff City, and they wander around the third floor trying to
you wander by your old office on the third floor. That's a whole nother story. We don't even want to go there.
Yeah, they either press certain issues or say, don't vote for that. So from your standpoint, were there any particular issues that you really had to push this session? And then looking ahead, because things seem to have changed a lot in the last year or two on what seems to be priorities or what can legitimately be done in the legislature.
But we had several issues. Dealing with the new stadium, dealing with the reentry programs for ex-offenders, and I work closely with the mayor's office and a gentleman by the name of Rodney Hubbard, who you all know, who I actually report to, fighting to get funding, and we got that funded. A math and science program that we work closely with Senator Jamila Nasheed on for, St. Louis Public Schools. So it's a lot that's going on, but the city basic agenda is making sure we get the adequate funding or the adequate tax credits we need for economic development in the city of St. Louis. We play more of a regional game as opposed to just a localized St. Louis City game.
Now, tax credits some years have been on. They've been like the highlighted thing. Everybody's after them. They want to cut them. We've had different guests on the show who had been, in previous legislative sessions, been part of a group to try to really slash them. This session, it seemed like it didn't hardly even come up. Low-income tax credits or the historic tax credits didn't really come up. I'm curious as to your take about, so in effect, it was a win for those who support the programs, but I'm interested in your take on why the General Assembly seemed to be off on other things, weren't even paying attention.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with, well, you know this better than me, elections and politics. It's just like we had a ethics reform bill that
went nowhere.
But I'm going to tell you something, a lot of the lobbyists were really pushing for the ethics reform bills because there's a lot of reporting that you have to do, and there's a lot of, contributions and whining and dining. And most lobbyists really would rather spend their time doing other things, talking about the issues and staying
So
focused.
You don't like giving like a $300 steak to the Speaker of the House or anything?
No. You know what? In my level of lobbying and being a consultant is surely based on facts and relationships. So I think a lot of lobbyists, this is my opinion, I believe that 80 or 90% of the people you ever talk to about an issue are already where they're going to be anyway. And so when it comes to the whining and dining, it takes up a lot of your time. You could be at a baseball game, you could be at a football game, but most people would rather be out with their families or just taking care of other businesses as opposed to doing the whining and dining.
Well, that's a very interesting perspective.
And that's kind of the sentiments that I get from a lot of the lobbyists. They're like, well, I have to take them out because, not that the legislators asked to be taken out, but, it may be their clients just saying, well, won't you take some legislators out?
Yeah, now 20 years ago, back when they had the first effort, which succeeded for about 14 years for campaign donation limits, before that, you could tell right after candidate filing, there would literally be a line outside the Anheuser-Busch building. There would be a line of legislators and lawmakers and potential candidates. I was there one time and watched the line. They would go in. It was like they had a series of meetings. And one of the rumors was that actually when campaign donation limits, it's convoluted. The legislature passed some, the state voters passed some, but the bottom line was that privately we were hearing that some of the Anheuser-Busch executives at the time were big fans of campaign donation limits because they wanted to get rid of that line.
Well,
because it was so overt.
That was another unexpected jumping off point. You were one of the Democrats that voted to repeal campaign finance limits. Do you have any regrets about that?
I think it was one of the worst votes I ever taken in my life.
Why?
Because now you have 4 or 5 guys who are dumping an extreme amount of money into politics, and I think it makes legislators uncomfortable. But you have them lining up that are taking the contributions. I just think that, there should be a limit. When you think about a guy giving $50,000, $100,000, $1 million in one particular race, I just think it's crazy.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this because one thing I noticed is after you and Jamila Nasheed voted to repeal campaign finance limits, I think I actually remember a picture of Paul LaVota literally yelling at Jamila Nasheed. You guys were outcast. You were castigated as traitors. And one of the things I noticed is that some of the senators, the Democratic senators who voted for this, I know I talk about Chris Koster a lot, voted against it, or voted to get rid of campaign finance limits, but also Ryan McKenna, Victor Callahan, Harry Kennedy. It seemed like no criticism went that way. Did you notice that?
I've always noticed that, but I think when you look into who's getting the contributions and who's getting the supports, and when you look at Democrats, and preferably African-American Democrats, they don't get the support, or they don't get the financial support or the resources to run any election. And I'm not being facetious here. It wasn't until, I really got involved and I started getting the support from people like Rex Sinquefield and other education reform entities across the country, where you start seeing the 10,000, 25,000 type contributions. But if you look at even into the campaign contributions today, no African-American Democrats is getting the 10,000.
Well, do you think there was like a racial double standard on that issue?
No doubt about it.
So someone like Koster is able to basically be against campaign finance limits and get no criticism, whereas you are against it and you get lots of criticism?
That's true, but you have to also look at his circle. He's came from the Republican Party, who was at that time in the super majority in the House and the Senate. It was fresh. It was new. You had people from right to work to developers to, lawyers who give more money probably than anybody. They were out there on the forefront. So when you look at people like Chris who travels in a different circle, and then you look at somebody like me who come from a public housing development, went to HBCU, it takes a while for you to build those type relationships to get in the circles. And I strongly believe that a person will give you or donate to you $10,000 quicker than they would give you $100, but it's about the circle.
And I just want to be clear. I mentioned a lot on this show that Koster's against campaign finance limits. I'm not saying that's the wrong position. I'm not saying that it's the right position. I've just noticed, and I've said this before, that, there's all this talk among the Democratic Party about reinstating campaign finance limits, and they throw a lot of arrows against Republicans, yet Koster, who has never repented for his vote, basically gets no criticism for it. And we've asked people on this show about it. They've given their answers. I felt it was appropriate to ask you because it seemed like it's a different standard.
He does. Well, I think to Koster's credit, he is very upfront about it.
He's very upfront about it.
His point is it's not that he's in favor of big donations, but his point is if you restrict them, the money's going to come in somewhere else, and it's going to be less transparent. So he maybe take a stance on transparency.
Right. And then he's playing at a high level. You're talking about somebody who's running statewide,
right?
From somebody who's spending, $30,000 to $50,000 per election on a state rep level or automatic level, to someone who's spending tens of millions of dollars on TV. So it's a different game.
I wanted to talk about Paul McKee, and the reason why is because I think you've been following his attempts to develop the North Side for a long time. I think you were involved in a state legislative level. I think you either used to or currently lobby for Paul McKee. What's your relationship with him?
Let me just say this. I've been knowing Paul for about 15 years. As a matter of fact, the first person who introduced me to Paul McKee was Russ Cornahan at the Claire McCaskill event. And so I always thought that, so crazily, when I first met Paul, I thought he was a Democrat. I didn't know later on that he was a Republican. But he has a lot of vision for North St. Louis, and I was one of his initial supporters because I believe that there was a lot of things that are missing in North St. Louis, considering somebody who comes from a public housing development. And had it not been for the Car Square neighborhood and people like McCormick and Barron coming in and investing their time, money, and resources, what would North St. Louis look like now?
Well, what about McKee's problems now? I mean, what do you think is going to happen? That was going to be what I was
going to ask, because right now,
it looks like it's collapsing.
There's a lot of people right now who are wondering, after all these years, after state tax credits, after city incentives, there's not much to show for it, and there's all these reports, including from our own Maria Altman, about his financial problems.
Yeah, I think, just like any other developer, whether it's the Roberts brothers or whether it's Donald Trump, you're gonna have good days, you're gonna have bad days,
or good years. Yeah,
good years. But one thing I can I'm just gonna be candid and real, as possibly I can be on the show, is that I've never seen Paul McKee go after anything and turn his back on it. I bought into his vision. I bought into his dream and wanted to make North St. Louis better. And on that, I think that's where we had some kindred spirits, because that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get off into politics as a young man, to say, well, maybe I can change it. But I saw that even in my own community, we would start projects, and it would take us, just now today, it's taken us 12 years to do a $9 million project of some residential housing for low-income people. So it's hard, it's rough, it's tough. I think he has a tough road ahead of him. I think that what I would like to see is more people who are on the level of developing urban America to jump in and become partners with the city and him and try to get something going.
Like I said, the Roberts brothers, who I've known pretty well for 35 years, what happened there? I mean, now it looks like there was hundreds of properties that Steve Roberts owned indirectly, and now they weren't kept up, and it's collapsed.
You just got too top heavy, and if you have money going out and nothing's coming in, and you land bank, I always thought that when I saw the Roberts trying to assemble land, that they were doing what McKee was doing, trying to assemble the land, which you have to outlay a tens of millions of dollars to do, and then try to recoup some of your revenue.
Yeah, by attracting big developments.
Exactly.
Yeah. Is that one of the problems, is that it's more difficult anywhere to attract, let's say, a big development? It almost has to be like small things.
I think you have to break it down. I don't believe in the Antonio French approach, block by block. We'll all be dead by then. I believe that you should just get the major players at the table and say, hey, here's a piece for you. You're good in residential. You're good in commercial. You're good in attracting the big block businesses, the Walmarts and those things of the world, and do it comprehensively.
I don't have a clip from Antonio French, but I do have one from Chris Carter, the alderman now, former state representative, and we were talking about the Promise Zone situation. He was concerned that a lot of the largesse of the Promise Zone, which for our listeners basically is a federal program that gives the area kind of better crack at federal money and federal programs. This is what he had to say about his concerns about the McKee project.
We have to get into these distressed areas. Where folks actually live, not these proposed huge plans where it's not in detail of what's going to exactly happen. Because right now, I think that anything that the city has going on with McKee should be on hold because of his financial standings all around the state and all around the country.
There are more than just Chris Carter and Antonio French who feel that the city and the state should stop giving McKee incentives. What do you say about that?
I think Chris Carter and Antonio French are a joke.
Why?
Seriously.
Okay, go ahead.
And the reason I say that is because you look at the crime rate in the city of St. Louis. You look at the zip code over there with Antonio French, all the murders that are taking place every day. You look at what's going on in Chris Carter's ward. I don't hear him jumping up and down on TV or walking with the chief or walking with the mayor trying to clean up crime and drugs in their community. But, a lot of people like to pile on when folks are taking shots at you. It's easy to take a shots against McKee, and I'm not here defending them, but I don't see them actually involved in their own wards. I'm just being honest with you. I mean, Antonio French has some of the biggest gang activity over there in his ward. Chris Carter has more drugs being sold in his ward. And I didn't see him just lapping on against Paul. I don't think anything should happen in North St. Louis because of Paul McKee. Well, what are you doing in your community? And when you talk about development, what type of development are they having? What, they have a ribbon cutting ceremony for a gas station? I mean, what type of communities are they building? What do you see them at? And so when I hear from people like Antonio French or Chris Carter, here's this man Paul McKee, and like I said, I'm not taking up for him. He put out $100 million of his own money. To me, I wouldn't have done it, but he did it. And was he going to make money off the deal? Of course he was. But what type of development do they have going on in their neighborhood? And if you look at, ride through their neighborhood. Do me a favor.
Oh, yeah.
Ride through their neighborhood and tell me what you see. You see storefront churches. You see gas stations and you see liquor stores.
But
How many
I've
jobs are they
driven through the
bringing in the
McKee
community?
footprint too, and I'm not seeing much either right there. And I understand that there's a lot of challenges there. I understand that there was a lawsuit that probably kept him from doing things. But I mean, a normal, maybe non-politically involved person is wondering where is this development that was promised?
Jason, and I guess why I'm so passionate about it is because it's a neighborhood that I still live in.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
I've walked over dead bodies growing up. I've seen guys die with needles in their veins, and seeing childhood friends getting their brains blew out on my way to school. So when you start talking about North St. Louis, it becomes very passionate to me. And I've heard people attack Paul. Like I said, I'm not here even defending him. You made some valid points. But what's the solution? I mean, we all could talk about Paul McKee. We could talk about tax credits. We could talk about North St. Louis. But if you truly believe that St. Louis is the economic engine for the state of Missouri, if it's not Paul, we'll bring somebody else in. Who else is going to develop money and try to fight for this? What is it, the geospatial?
The National Geospatial.
They're against that, and that's going to bring how many millions of dollars to the city of St. Louis? I've seen those gentlemen be against St. Louis on every turn. If I was Paul, you know what I would do? Or any other developer? I would go to the city and say, hey, here's my land. Give me my money back. I'm headed to Brooklyn. I think they want some development. I'm out of here.
Well, hopefully we'll have both of those gentlemen on the show eventually to respond. But we only have a few minutes left. I kind of wanted to get your take on maybe politics a little bit more distantly. We had the mayor of St. Louis, Francis Slay, on St. Louis on the Air last week. He was asked by Don Marsh whether there would be a fifth term in his horizon, and he said yes as of now.
Yeah, he's been talking about that for a while.
A couple of things that I want to ask. I from what I gather, I think that you were supportive of Mayor Slay for his fourth term, and as was your sister and your mother as well, and I assume also your dad, the committeeman. Do you think, though, after the stadium situation with crime going as it is now, do you think he's in a slightly more tenuous position going in for a fifth term?
Well, I think, first of all, I commend Mayor Francis Slay for all the hard work he's done. And my history with him dates back over 20-some years. I didn't even know him when I started getting involved in politics, but I was always a friend of his father's. When I was young, growing up in the community, he would give ex-offenders and drug addicts jobs and help get them off the street. So that's how my relationship with the mayor began to develop before he was even the mayor. So I think anytime you're in a political arena and you're holding one particular office and you stay around too long, your supporters as well as the community may become lethargic when it comes to you representing them. But just to be totally honest with you, I don't know who else out there really has the capacity, the machine, can raise the money or understand development or the school system or even the crime issue, who's ready to take on being the mayor of the city of St. Louis. And I think that's a travesty. I think that's sad because when you look at the talent pool, I mean, who are you going to go get?
Well, we could speculate all we want, but I did want to touch
and who can win?
And who can win.
Okay, yeah. And now what about you? Are you ever thinking about getting back into politics?
What I've learned, by my stay out of politics, that I can do more, working with different organizations and working with different community leaders, just to basically give them the support and say, hey, well, I happen to run into this guy from New York or this guy from D.C. Won't you give him a call? He has this educational model that we're trying to push from Florida. But I think I can better serve humanity by working.
So are you saying that losing to Robin Wright Jones was the best thing that ever happened to you? Because it seems I know that there was an ethics situation you had to get, and you can read about that in the papers, but it seems like your fortunes have skyrocketed dramatically now that you're not running for anything anymore.
Well, I think, you know what, that in life you have to do what you love. And what I love is helping people. And whether it's representing them or, or holding elected office, I think that's really something for more of. I want to see more younger people getting involved. Mm-hmm. And I'll be 43 this year, but I'm looking for the next 24, 25-year-old that's coming up, 30-year-old that's coming up, and getting behind them and supporting them.
Well, what do you think about some of the...
Because it is taxing. Let me say this. Being in public office is not only taxing financially. I'm getting a call right here from my good friend
Jamil Nasheed, who we've had on the podcast twice.
It's not only taxing, but it's also financially, but it's also a burden on your family and being with your kids.
What advice would you have for kind of the new wave of African American politicians, such as the Joshua Peters, the Michael Butlers, the Clem Smiths, or even the Antonio Frenches and Chris Carters, who you just castigated on the show? What advice would you have?
I took it light on them, considering I helped both of them get elected.
Understood. But what kind of advice? It's kind of the gray-bearded elder statements, like especially someone who's gone through their own political battles but are now friends with some of the people that they battled with. What advice do you have to them going forward?
I would say, I'll give them some advice that I got from a good friend of mine, Gracia Backer. You remember Gracia?
Yeah, I know. Yes, I know.
When
Gracia
I first
very
wanted to get
well.
in politics, she sat down with me and she said, no matter what happens, whether you win or you lose, when the music stops and you're able to look in that mirror, be able to hold your head up high and be able to walk out that Capitol and don't look back, but know that you gave it your best shot, that you put your best foot forward, and never lose your passion, your desire to do what it's really all about, serving the humanity. I think what's lost in politics, a lot of politicians think that the people are supposed to serve them, and they should be there as a public servant to serve the people.
Well, hopefully some of the people will listen to that advice, but we'll have to see in the future whether they follow through on it. But thank you so much for coming in.
I mean, I'm honored to be here.
And
I'm a fan of yours, and I don't get along with a lot of reporters. But I love this woman right here.
And I'm also very fond of Joe as well. So to close this out, you can read all of our stories at stlpublicradio.org. You can follow me on Twitter at @JRosenbaum. You can follow Joe on Twitter at
JMannies. That's JMannies.
And where can we follow you on Twitter?
You can follow me on Twitter at Rodney or Hubbard, HUBBARD.
And until next week, so long.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.